Let's go back to the phone lines, and we'll talk next to Deborah, listening in Nashville, Tennessee. Hi, Deborah.
Hi, how you doing, Hank?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing well. I was listening to another Bible teacher, and they were going over Habakkuk, and I'm not as familiar with that book, so a verse came up that caught my attention. It would be Habakkuk 2, verse 17. I was curious what was meant. I generally understand the context, but at the same time, what was it meant when it says that your destruction of animals will terrify you? What were they doing, or is that to animals, or was that a metaphor? Did they just go around slaughtering indiscriminately, or was it a sacrifice type of thing? What was going on there?
You know what? I'd have to look at that passage because for some reason or other I cannot call it up in my in my head. It's 2:17.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd have to take a look at that. Does it have to do with the violence that occurs with Lebanon and the plunder of beasts, which made them afraid because of men's blood and the violence in the land and the city who dwell in it? I think one of the things that you have to take into consideration with that passage, if I have the right passage, is that the Babylonians were going to be the chastening rod upon the nations, and an announcement that provides Habakkuk to actually question Yahweh further. How could the Lord of righteousness bring against his own people a nation more wicked than themselves? And in the end, Habakkuk praises God, or Habakkuk, I should say, praises God's wisdom, even though he does not fully understand the ways of God. In terms of the specific passage, destruction of animals, there were Assyrian inscriptions that record hunting expeditions in Lebanon. If again, that's the area that we're talking about. Is it Lebanon in the passage?
Yes, it is.
And that kind of sport may have been indulged in by the invading Babylonians, and therefore Babylonian violence was destructive to all forms of life, not only of lands and cities, but life in general. And that's why, again, the question by Habakkuk, how in the world can God use the Babylonians as the acts of his judgment when they are even more evil in his mind? So that's the issue that's being addressed.
Okay, so basically they were committing all kinds of atrocities, and it's not a metaphor, it's actually things that they did that were, abominable. Okay.
Yeah, I think you could use it as a metaphor because the abominations have more to do with on kind of a global sense than just animals, but that's a great illustration of it.
Okay, well, that makes sense, because from what I can understand from the passage, the Babylonians were just horrific, and I understand why Habakkuk would say, well, why would you do this, Lord? Because like today, we are all waiting and wondering, when is God going to say enough is enough? So, the atrocities today versus the atrocities then, it makes sense.
Yeah, and what I said earlier, again, in principle, is something that all of us ought to attain to, and that is Habakkuk is praising God's wisdom even though he does not fully understand the ways of God. So he is submitting himself, bowing his knee before a God who takes all converging factors into consideration, and therefore praising God's ways as being altogether right.
So that would be a good reminder for us at these times as well, wouldn't it?
It most certainly would be, yes.
That makes sense. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. And I'd actually have to look at the passage a little more closely to give you any more detail than I was able to give you there. But it's one of those obscure passages for me that I haven't looked at in a long time.
Yes, and being a quote minor prophet, a lot of times people don't cover it. So it's new to me more in that sense. I've not heard people go in depth with Habakkuk. Everybody loves Isaiah and Elijah.
Exactly. Yeah.